When we invite someone into our homes to care for our children, we are participating in a profound act of trust. This trust is not superficial, it is existential, a recognition that the safety, well-being, and development of a young life are now, at least partially, in another person's hands. Parents operate under the assumption that they have carefully vetted the person, that their references are credible, that the background checks are thorough. But trust, however carefully constructed, is never absolute. It is always provisional, contingent upon behavior, motivation, and the alignment of moral frameworks between the caregiver and the family. This is the unsettling lesson embedded in the story recounted by Reddit user 108DC3s, which we are about to examine in depth. The family in question appeared, at first glance, to have taken all reasonable precautions. They had a structured household, clear rules for their children, and a methodical approach to hiring an au pair. The candidate they selected seemed ideal, personable, articulate, attentive, and endorsed with glowing references. She exuded confidence, friendliness, and competence, qualities that naturally reassure parents. And yet, appearances are deceptive. The human mind tends to favor narrative cohesion, to assume that someone presenting themselves in alignment with social norms is reliable and safe. But the veneer of trustworthiness can mask motives, personality traits, and intentions that are fundamentally misaligned with the moral and ethical expectations placed upon a caregiver. In the first days of her tenure, the anomalies were subtle, almost imperceptible, almost trivial. Objects slightly out of place, minor disruptions in routine, fleeting episodes of evasiveness or inconsistency. At this stage, most parents might dismiss these events as normal household irregularities or the quirks of a child-focused environment. It is human nature to discount minor disturbances when overall patterns appear acceptable. However, these anomalies were not random. They were the initial manifestations of a deliberate pattern. Here, the first psychological principle emerges: small deviations, when observed over time and within a relational context, can indicate underlying intentions. Cognitive heuristics often lull us into complacency, particularly when initial impressions of trustworthiness are strong. As the days turned into weeks, these small anomalies accumulated. The au pair began implementing subtle changes in the household, shifting children's schedules without informing parents, encouraging behaviors that were contrary to household rules, and introducing minor yet psychologically manipulative exercises that unsettled the children. These were not catastrophic events, not in the immediate sense, but they eroded the foundational structure of the family's expectations. The children, confused and anxious, began to display subtle behavioral changes: reluctance to speak freely with their parents, increased clinginess, and occasional distress that could not be readily explained. This scenario illustrates a profound truth about human psychology: manipulation is often incremental, and by exploiting trust, the manipulator can operate below the threshold of immediate detection. The family initially attempted to address these issues through direct communication, inquiring about the changes and attempting to reassert boundaries. The au pair, however, was skilled at providing plausible explanations, at framing herself as helpful, attentive, and sensitive to the children's needs. This dynamic reveals the intersection of social intelligence and moral hazard. Individuals with high interpersonal acumen can mask unethical or harmful behavior while maintaining the appearance of compliance with social expectations. For parents, this presents a unique challenge. The person who should be nurturing and protective is simultaneously subverting their authority and altering the psychological environment of the children. The narrative escalates further when tangible risks began to emerge. Certain instructions given to the children conflicted with safety rules, such as minor but significant lapses in supervision during outdoor play and encouraging experimentation with household items in ways that introduced danger. These acts, while not immediately catastrophic, exemplify the insidious nature of this particular horror: the convergence of negligence, manipulation, and the incremental erosion of trust. Psychologically, parents experience a dissonance here. They perceive the danger but are constrained by social norms, politeness, and initial trust. The very structures that allow for effective parental vigilance are being undermined from within. The children's responses became more pronounced. Anxiety, confusion, and subtle behavioral regression began to surface. In developmental psychology, this phenomenon is well documented. Children are highly sensitive to inconsistencies in authority, to breaches of trust, and to the social cues provided by those responsible for their care. Even minor disruptions in expected behavior from a caregiver can manifest as stress, insecurity, and confusion in the child's cognitive and emotional landscape. This is where the story intersects with philosophy. The moral responsibility of the caregiver extends beyond the immediate provision of safety. It encompasses the ethical, psychological, and developmental well-being of the children. Breaches of this responsibility, even subtle ones, have real consequences. As the pattern intensified, the parents confronted the reality they had previously discounted. The au pair was actively manipulating both the children and the household environment. The small anomalies were no longer trivial. They were deliberate interventions that placed the children's psychological and physical well-being at risk. Parents now faced a dual horror. First, the betrayal of trust, which shakes the very foundation of human relational assumptions, and second, the recognition that the safety and stability of their children were being compromised in a manner they had not anticipated. Trust, once granted, had been weaponized. The parents' response required immediate and sustained action. They implemented direct observation, stricter supervision, and a systematic review of routines and interactions. The process demanded cognitive vigilance, emotional regulation, and ethical clarity. Every interaction needed to be interpreted, every minor anomaly assessed for potential risk, and every decision weighed for immediate and long-term consequences. The psychological toll of this sustained hypervigilance is profound. Humans are not naturally designed for continuous moral, cognitive, and emotional monitoring of complex relational systems. The intensity of responsibility, combined with the fear of failure, produces a stress response that tests resilience, judgment, and composure. Eventually, the situation culminated in the termination of the au pair's employment. The parents removed the source of risk, restored the children to stable routines, and attempted to repair the psychological and relational damage. However, the consequences lingered. The children had experienced subtle psychological manipulation. The parents had been forced to confront the limits of their discernment, and the household had been exposed to latent vulnerabilities. This episode illustrates a broader philosophical and psychological truth. Trust is necessary for human social systems, yet it carries inherent risk. The ethical and moral weight of placing children in another's care cannot be underestimated, nor can the vigilance required to safeguard them. In reflecting upon this story, several insights emerge. First, the incremental nature of manipulation is a critical psychological principle. Subtle interventions repeated over time can reshape perceptions, behaviors, and relational dynamics without immediate detection. Second, appearances are unreliable. Competence, warmth, and social skill can mask intentions that are fundamentally misaligned with ethical responsibility. Third, human vigilance has limits. Parents must balance trust with observation, guidance with autonomy, and intervention with the cultivation of independent judgment in their children. Failure to do so can result in both psychological harm and breaches of moral responsibility. This story, while deeply unsettling, is not merely cautionary, it is instructive. It demands reflection on the fragility of trust, the complexity of human behavior, and the ethical imperatives of caregiving. It reminds us that our assumptions, while necessary for functioning, must be constantly interrogated, that vigilance, while stressful, is an essential component of responsible parenting, and that moral clarity is required to navigate the ambiguous and often treacherous landscape of human relationships. In conclusion, the story of The Trust That Turned Deadly forces us to recognize that trust, while foundational to human interaction, is never unqualified. Parenting demands not only love and care, but also sustained ethical awareness, psychological acuity, and the courage to confront deception and manipulation when it arises. The horror of the narrative lies not only in the actions of the au pair, but in the stark illumination of human vulnerability. The vulnerability inherent in trust, the vulnerability inherent in the delegation of care, and the vulnerability inherent in our moral responsibility to protect those who depend upon us. This story leaves us with a reflective imperative. Vigilance is not mere suspicion, nor is trust mere compliance. It is an active, morally charged engagement with the world, with human behavior, and with the ethical demands of caregiving. The lesson is clear: protect diligently, observe attentively, and never underestimate the weight of the responsibility entrusted to you when another human life depends on your discernment, care, and unwavering moral engagement. When we consider the act of leaving a child in someone else's care, particularly in the context of an au pair or caregiver, we are navigating a profound intersection of trust, responsibility, and vulnerability. This is not a simple delegation of tasks, it is an ethical, psychological, and existential contract. Parents operate under the assumption that the person entrusted with the child will act in alignment with their moral, practical, and emotional expectations. Yet, as the story recounted by Reddit user 1D9Geeks reveals, this assumption can be tragically misplaced. In this instance, a young boy, 6 years old, was left under the supervision of an au pair who, for months, had presented herself as competent, attentive, and nurturing. Her demeanor was calm, her interactions with the child affectionate, and her engagement with the family outwardly reassuring. The parents believed, perhaps instinctively, that they had chosen wisely. They had reviewed references, discussed routines, and established protocols for outings and activities. And yet, even with these precautions, the ordinary act of taking a child for a routine walk, a simple, everyday responsibility, became a crucible for disaster. The morning of the incident began without incident, unremarkable in every way. The child's schedule was followed, breakfast consumed, and clothing prepared. The au pair announced that she would take him to a nearby park, a familiar route, entirely within the boundaries previously agreed upon. Parents, exercising both prudence and trust, observed the preparations, gave verbal instructions, and allowed the departure with the expectation of safety and compliance. At this moment, we see the first psychological dynamic at play: the implicit reliance on procedural consistency. Parents trust that past performance predicts future behavior, that routines create predictability, and that small contingencies will be managed competently. This assumption, while statistically reasonable, is nevertheless fallible. Within minutes of departure, the first disruption occurred. The child, momentarily distracted by a passing dog, wandered slightly off the familiar route. The au pair, seemingly attentive, did not immediately intervene. It is unclear whether this was an error in judgment, a lapse of attention, or something more deliberate. Nonetheless, the consequence was immediate. The child's presence on a public sidewalk introduced exposure to risks the parents had assumed were mitigated. This illustrates a core psychological truth: small lapses, when interacting with unpredictable variables, can escalate rapidly into critical situations. Human supervision is a complex cognitive task requiring divided attention, situational awareness, and anticipatory judgment. Even minimal errors can produce disproportionate consequences. The escalation was swift. The child, curious and unrestrained, moved further from the expected path. The au pair, rather than correcting the behavior promptly, engaged in a form of passive oversight, allowing the child's exploration to continue. From the perspective of developmental psychology, children at this age are highly exploratory and often fail to recognize latent hazards. They rely on adults to establish and enforce boundaries that prevent harm. Here, the combination of curiosity and insufficient supervision transformed an ordinary walk into a high-risk scenario. The parent's expectation of predictable, rule-compliant behavior on the part of both child and caregiver collided with the reality of human unpredictability. By the time the parents became aware of the delay in returning home, panic had already set in. The au pair had, at some point, lost sight of the child, or had allowed the child to leave her immediate proximity. This breach, whether accidental or negligent, underscores a profound tension in caregiving: the balance between autonomy and oversight. Parents implicitly trust that caregivers will maintain both attentiveness and initiative. When this balance is disrupted, even briefly, the consequences can be catastrophic. The child's disappearance, though momentary, illuminated the fragility of parental trust and the vulnerability of placing a dependent life in another's hands. The psychological impact on the parents was immediate and severe. Anxiety, fear, and the perception of existential threat converged, creating a state of acute stress. The human brain, when confronted with potential harm to a loved one, particularly a child, engages the sympathetic nervous system, heightening alertness, focus, and reactive capacity. Yet these heightened states also challenge rational problem-solving, requiring the parents to navigate panic while coordinating search efforts, notifying authorities, and managing communication with neighbors and witnesses. This dual cognitive, emotional engagement illustrates the psychological weight of caregiving. Even when the caregiver is not the direct source of threat, but is responsible for managing it. From a philosophical perspective, this scenario highlights the ethical dimensions of responsibility. Parents delegate authority and oversight, but the ultimate accountability for a child's safety remains theirs. The disappearance of a child, even for a brief period, forces a confrontation with moral contingency. The realization that all precautions are provisional, that even competent supervision is fallible, and that human life is perpetually exposed to risk despite intention and diligence. The horror is not merely the immediate fear, but the existential recognition of vulnerability. The understanding that parental responsibility is inescapable, even when mediated through others. The resolution of the event, thankfully, came when the child was located by a passerby a few blocks from the park. The child was unharmed physically but deeply shaken emotionally. The au pair's negligence, whether intentional or inadvertent, had introduced trauma and a temporary but profound sense of insecurity. This outcome illustrates the broader psychological principle: exposure to perceived danger, even without physical harm, imprints lasting effects on the developing mind. Children internalize experiences of unpredictability, lapses in supervision, and threats to safety, which can influence attachment patterns, anxiety levels, and trust in caregivers over time. In analyzing this story, several insights emerge. First, supervision is a complex cognitive task that requires continuous attentional allocation, situational awareness, and anticipation of risk. Second, parental trust, while necessary, is always provisional and requires active engagement and verification. Third, the emotional and ethical stakes of caregiving are extraordinarily high. A single lapse, however minor it may appear at the time, can have disproportionate consequences for both children and parents. These insights compel us to consider not only procedural safety measures but also the cognitive, ethical, and psychological capacities required for effective childcare. The story also underscores the need for structured oversight and contingency planning. The family in question, reflecting on the incident, implemented additional safeguards, clearly defined walking routes, check-in protocols, and enhanced communication strategies. These measures are not merely bureaucratic, they represent an active engagement with risk management, ethical responsibility, and the moral imperative to protect vulnerable lives. By analyzing both failure and response, parents can cultivate resilience, foresight, and a structured approach to delegation of care that mitigates risk while fostering trust. Ultimately, The Child Who Vanished Under Watch is not simply a narrative about negligence. It is a meditation on human fallibility, ethical responsibility, and the precariousness of trust. It forces reflection on the cognitive and moral dimensions of caregiving, the interplay between attention, judgment, and ethical obligation, the fragility of trust when confronted with human error, and the imperative to cultivate awareness, vigilance, and proactive intervention. The horror lies not merely in the moment of disappearance, but in the recognition of how quickly ordinary circumstances can spiral into existential risk, revealing vulnerabilities that are always present but often unseen. In conclusion, this story compels us to engage in deliberate reflection. Trust must be balanced with vigilance, supervision must be paired with structured accountability, and parental responsibility is an enduring, morally charged engagement with uncertainty. The event is a stark reminder that human systems, no matter how carefully constructed, are always vulnerable to failure, and that ethical, cognitive, and emotional engagement is required to safeguard those who depend upon us. The lesson is both sobering and empowering. Vigilance, preparation, and ethical clarity are essential tools in the complex, morally fraught task of childcare. The story leaves us with a reflective imperative to act consciously, observe diligently, and recognize the profound weight of responsibility inherent in every moment of caregiving, because the safety, development, and emotional well-being of a child are contingent upon our capacity to meet these challenges with discernment, courage, and unwavering moral engagement. When we discuss the responsibility of entrusting our children to another human being, we are engaging with a fundamental paradox of human existence: the necessity of trust and the inevitability of uncertainty. Trust is the lifeblood of social cohesion, the mechanism by which we extend our capacity to care beyond the limitations of time, attention, and personal endurance. Yet trust is inherently risky because it assumes a moral alignment that may not exist. The story of The Hidden Darkness, as documented by sources like A Pair World, illustrates this precarious balance, revealing how appearances of competence and warmth can mask profound moral and psychological misalignment. At first, the au pair in question seemed exemplary. She was attentive, reliable, and personable, qualities that naturally engender trust. Parents, in their legitimate desire to ensure the well-being of their children while balancing professional and personal obligations, saw her as a solution to a practical problem. In the modern household where dual-income families often rely on external support for childcare, the au pair embodies both practical necessity and social expectation. She is, in essence, a mediator of parental responsibility, extending the reach of care into hours when the parents themselves are otherwise occupied. This makes the choice of au pair not merely administrative but profoundly ethical. It is a decision that impacts not only daily routines but also the psychological and emotional landscape of the household. Initially, her performance seemed impeccable. Routines were followed, meals were prepared, and the children responded positively to her presence. From a superficial perspective, this was an ideal arrangement. But human behavior is rarely fully transparent, and initial impressions, no matter how reassuring, are not definitive indicators of character or intent. Cognitive psychology teaches us that humans are predisposed to confirmation bias. When someone presents evidence consistent with our desires and expectations, we are inclined to trust further, even when subtle signals suggest caution. In this story, those signals were present but easily overlooked by the parents, who, like all humans, operated under the assumption that outward appearance is reflective of inner alignment. Over time, subtle anomalies began to manifest. Minor discrepancies in routine, small lapses in reporting, and occasional inconsistencies in explanations for seemingly trivial events began to accumulate. These were not dramatic violations. There were no immediate crises, no glaring emergencies. Instead, the pattern was insidious, a creeping erosion of reliability that undermined the foundation of trust. Here, the first psychological principle emerges: manipulation and deceit often operate incrementally. Small deviations, when considered in isolation, are easily rationalized or dismissed. Yet, when observed as a sequence, they reveal a deliberate strategy of influence or concealment. The children, perceptive in ways adults sometimes overlook, began to respond in subtle ways. Anxiety, reluctance to communicate fully, and minor behavioral regressions began to surface. These are classic indicators in developmental psychology of exposure to an environment in which predictability and safety are compromised. Children rely on consistent adult behavior to form secure attachments and to develop a coherent sense of the world. When the apparent reliability of a caregiver is undermined, even incrementally, the child's sense of security is shaken. This is not merely a question of routine or convenience. It is a profound disruption of the psychological scaffolding upon which healthy development is built. The parents, initially unaware of the depth of the problem, began to notice patterns that defied simple explanation. Personal items were moved or hidden without explanation, household rules were inconsistently enforced, and the children reported minor incidents that seemed contradictory or implausible. At this stage, the scenario demonstrates a critical insight about human relational dynamics. Deception is most effective when it is partial, selective, and intermittent. By mixing moments of compliance with subtle breaches of trust, the au pair maintained the appearance of reliability, while simultaneously exerting control and influence over the household environment. Eventually, the pattern escalated into behaviors that could no longer be ignored. Emotional manipulation became apparent. The au pair used secrecy, selective information, and coercion to shape the children's perceptions and actions. She presented herself as the sole source of understanding or guidance, subtly positioning the parents as secondary or unreliable. This dynamic illustrates a sophisticated form of psychological influence, one that exploits the natural human tendency to seek guidance, reassurance, and authority from perceived caretakers. It is a manipulation that is both relational and moral, undermining the family structure while maintaining the illusion of care. The parents, confronted with this emerging reality, faced both moral and practical dilemmas. How does one respond to a person who simultaneously performs necessary functions competently but violates trust in covert and psychologically damaging ways? The challenge is compounded by the social and ethical norms that govern adult relationships. Confrontation carries the risk of social conflict. Dismissal of warning signs risks damage to the children, and indecision allows the pattern of manipulation to continue. Here, the story intersects with both moral philosophy and developmental psychology. Ethical responsibility is not abstract. It is enacted moment by moment in decisions that affect real lives in tangible ways. The investigation into the au pair's behavior revealed disturbing personal histories and patterns that had been concealed during the hiring process. These included prior incidents of manipulation, undisclosed personal difficulties, and behavioral tendencies incompatible with the responsibilities of childcare. The discovery of these facts illustrates a critical lesson about human systems. Background checks, references, and social appearances are necessary but not sufficient to guarantee alignment with ethical and moral expectations. Human character is complex, context-sensitive, and often resistant to predictive assessment. Trust, therefore, must be actively maintained and continuously verified, particularly in environments where vulnerability is high. The impact on the children was significant, both immediately and over time. The subtle manipulations, the erosion of predictable routines, and the exposure to inconsistent authority figures created a climate of anxiety and uncertainty. Children internalized not only the overt actions of caregivers, but also the implicit relational cues that signal safety, reliability, and moral consistency. When these cues are disrupted, even subtly, developmental consequences can include heightened anxiety, diminished trust in authority, and challenges in forming secure attachments. This underscores a profound ethical imperative. Caregiving is not merely functional. It is deeply formative, shaping cognitive, emotional, and moral development in ways that are long-lasting and often irreversible. From the parent's perspective, the psychological toll was immense. The process of uncovering deception, reassessing trust, and reasserting authority demanded sustained cognitive, emotional, and moral effort. Parents experienced guilt, self-doubt, and the acute stress associated with the recognition that they had been misled in a domain of profound responsibility. The story demonstrates a broader truth about human relational systems. Vulnerability is inescapable, and the stakes of misplaced trust are measured not in minor inconvenience, but in the well-being and safety of dependent lives. Ultimately, the family removed the au pair from the household. The resolution was necessary but insufficient to erase the lingering consequences. The children required reassurance, the household needed restructuring, and the parents faced the ongoing challenge of repairing both psychological and relational stability. This narrative illustrates a key principle: interventions are necessary but reactive. The true task of responsible caregiving is proactive, requiring continuous vigilance, ethical clarity, and attentiveness to both overt and subtle signs of risk. The Hidden Darkness is not merely a cautionary tale. It is an exploration of human vulnerability, moral responsibility, and the intricate interplay between trust, perception, and ethical action. It teaches that appearances are often unreliable, that human behavior is complex and context-dependent, and that ethical responsibility extends beyond immediate functionality to encompass psychological and developmental consequences. It challenges parents, caregivers, and observers alike to cultivate discernment, to balance trust with verification, and to recognize that moral vigilance is not optional but essential. In conclusion, this story leaves us with a reflective imperative. The act of caregiving is profoundly ethical, psychologically demanding, and existentially significant. Vigilance, structured oversight, and moral clarity are not merely practical, they are essential to safeguarding the lives and development of those entrusted to our care. The horror of The Hidden Darkness lies not only in the actions of the au pair, but in the illumination of human vulnerability, the necessity of moral discernment, and the weight of responsibility inherent in parenting and caregiving. We are reminded finally that trust is both indispensable and provisional. It must be cultivated, monitored, and, when necessary, re-evaluated. The lesson is clear: in every moment of caregiving, in every act of delegation, and in every relationship built upon reliance, we must exercise not only love and care but also discernment, courage, and unwavering ethical engagement. The safety, well-being, and moral development of dependent lives demand nothing less.